What if the most brutal line spoken in a glittering Hollywood ballroom wasn't meant to entertain at all, but to expose something everyone in the room already believed? Picture this. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Crystal chandeliers throwing light across tailored tuxedos. Silk dresses brushing marble floors. Laughter floating just a little too loudly, the way it does when powerful people are pretending to relax. This wasn't a movie premiere. This wasn't a red carpet circus designed for fans. This was Actors' Night, an industry-only gathering where reputations are weighed quietly, where careers are nudged forward or quietly stalled over cocktails and inside jokes. And then a voice cut through the room. You have zero talent. No pause. No wink. No obvious punchline. Just a sentence that landed like a dropped glass. Now let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard someone in Hollywood say what they actually think, out loud, in public, with no safety net? Because this wasn't social media. This wasn't a tweet that could be deleted. This wasn't a podcast clip buried behind disclaimers. This happened in a room full of people who decide who gets cast, who gets funded, and who slowly fades away. And the name attached to that moment? Meghan Markle. From the outside, it looked like another celebrity controversy. Another headline. Another round of fans and critics screaming past each other online. But inside that room, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous to a Hollywood career than bad press. A shift. Tonight, we're not here to pile on. We're not here to defend. And we're definitely not here to recycle tabloid noise. We're here to understand why this moment mattered. Why it happened now. And why one sentence, spoken by Odessa A'zion at Actors' Night, hosted by the Actor Awards, may have done more damage than years of online criticism ever could. But before we get there, we need to slow down. Because stories like this are never really about the words themselves. They're about timing, power, frustration, and the unspoken rules that everyone follows until someone breaks them. Let's start with the room. Actors' Night isn't flashy in the way the Oscars are flashy. There are no screaming fans outside, no army of photographers, no viral fashion breakdowns the next morning. That's by design. This is an industry pressure valve, a place where actors, writers, producers, casting directors, and agents let their guard down just enough to speak honestly. Think of it like a confessional without a priest. You don't attend Actors' Night to be seen by the public. You attend to be seen by the right people. And if you don't belong there, if your presence feels forced, strategic, or performative, everyone notices. That matters. File it away. Now, Meghan Markle's presence at an event like this already carried weight before a single word was spoken. Not because of her acting resume alone, but because of the cultural baggage attached to her name. She isn't just an actress in that room. She isn't just a former royal. She is a symbol of fame, controversy, media narratives, and power that didn't come the traditional Hollywood way. And Hollywood, for all its progressiveness, is deeply traditional about one thing: how you earn your place. Actors respect struggle. They respect craft. They respect time spent auditioning, being rejected, and quietly improving. What they do not respect, at least privately, is perceived shortcuts, borrowed status, or celebrity that arrives without the shared pain of the process. That doesn't mean they're right. It does mean they're human. So when Meghan entered that room, reactions were mixed. Not dramatic, not obvious, just subtle. Slight pauses in conversation. Glances held a fraction too long. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. This wasn't hostility. It was evaluation. Now let's talk about Odessa A'zion. Because this story collapses into cheap outrage if you treat her like a random heckler. She wasn't. And that's exactly why the moment landed so hard. Odessa isn't a tabloid favorite. She doesn't chase viral moments. She isn't known for inflammatory speeches or attention-grabbing antics. In fact, among actors, she's known for almost the opposite. Blunt honesty delivered without flourish. No cushion, no apology tour. Which raises the first uncomfortable question of the night. Why would someone like that say something so explosive? Was it a joke that misfired? Was it frustration boiling over? Or was it something else entirely? A line that had been sitting in the room, unspoken, waiting for someone reckless or honest enough to say it. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because the phrase, zero talent, wasn't just insulting. It was specific. And in an actor's space, specificity matters. Actors insult each other all the time, but usually in safe ways. They call performances flat, miscast, or not ready. They critique choices, not worth. To say zero talent isn't a critique of a role. It's a challenge to legitimacy. And legitimacy is the currency of that room. But before we dissect the moment itself, we need to understand the pressure building up to it. Because no one wakes up and detonates a sentence like that without a fuse already burning. For years now, Meghan Markle has occupied a strange space in popular culture. Too famous to ignore. Too polarizing to be neutral. Praised loudly in public. Questioned quietly in private. Here's the contradiction. Online, she is constantly discussed, analyzed, defended, attacked, her every move dissected. That level of visibility creates the illusion of relevance within an industry. But Hollywood doesn't run on noise. It runs on calls, meetings, roles offered without auditions, and whispers that never reach the press. Inside industry circles, there has been a growing tension between image and output, between narrative and craft, between being talked about and being hired. An actor's night, ironically, is where those contradictions surface. That night, Odessa didn't arrive intending to start a cultural firestorm. By all accounts, she was relaxed, comfortable, speaking to peers, the kind of environment where performers let their masks slip. Then the microphone came out. And here's where your stomach should tighten. Because the most dangerous moments in any industry aren't planned confrontations. They're unguarded truths spoken casually, without calculation. The room wasn't primed for shock. It was primed for honesty. So when Odessa's comment landed, it didn't feel like a scandal in real time. It felt like something breaking its surface tension. Some people laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter is what humans do when reality surprises them. Others froze. A few looked down at their drinks, suddenly fascinated by the ice melting in their glasses. And Meghan? She heard it. Make no mistake. She heard it. This is where narratives split. Online, the moment would later be framed as bullying, jealousy, cruelty, or even misogyny. Some of those interpretations deserve discussion. Others are reflexive defenses that ignore context. Inside the room, something else was happening. People weren't asking, "How dare she say that?" They were asking, "Why did she feel comfortable saying that here?" That difference matters. Because Hollywood is ruthless, but it is also strategic. People don't burn bridges unless they believe the bridge is already collapsing. And that brings us to the real tension at the heart of this story. What happens when celebrity walks into a room that values credibility more than fame? What happens when narrative collides with craft? And what happens when someone says the quiet part out loud? This is not a story about whether Meghan Markle is talented. Talent is subjective. Always has been. Always will be. This is a story about perception. About who controls the story, and what happens when control slips. Because after that sentence was spoken, something subtle but irreversible began to shift. Not in headlines, not on social media, but in how the room breathed, in who leaned back, in who leaned in, and in who stopped pretending. But here's the twist. The most important reaction that night wasn't applause, or outrage, or silence. It was what happened next. Because as the laughter faded and the air thickened, the question wasn't whether Odessa had gone too far. The question was how Meghan would respond. And in Hollywood, response is everything. Because grace can save a career, and defensiveness can quietly end one. So before we move forward, before we dissect the roast, the reactions, and the consequences, you need to understand one thing. This moment did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of tension, unspoken judgments, and a widening gap between public image and private opinion. And the room that night? It didn't just witness a roast. It witnessed a reckoning. But what happened in the seconds after those words were spoken, how the room reacted, who stayed silent, and who shifted their gaze, would change the trajectory of the night in ways no one anticipated. Because what came next would change everything. And no one in that room saw it coming. Every industry has a room where reputations are quietly built or destroyed. In Hollywood, that room isn't on a red carpet. It isn't behind the velvet ropes of a movie premiere. It isn't even the exclusive suites of the Oscars after-party. No, the real judgment room is smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous. And on this particular night, that room was the Grand Hall of Actors Night, hosted by the Actor Awards. The chandeliers were dripping crystal over polished hardwood floors, reflecting fragmented light onto the elegantly dressed crowd. Tuxedos fit like armor. Gowns trailed in silk whispers across marble. At first glance, it looked like another glamorous industry gathering, a night designed for photos and polite applause. But as anyone who's ever been there will tell you, the glamour is a mask. Beneath the sparkling surface is a network of subtle hierarchies, invisible alliances, and silent competitions. Every glance, every sip of champagne, every chuckle is measured, carefully catalogued in the minds of the people who hold real power. The atmosphere was intoxicating. The room buzzed with the low hum of preening, networking, and the occasional burst of laughter. But for anyone with an ear tuned to the subtext, there was tension, too. A tension that whispered, someone here is about to misstep. Someone here is about to get real. And then there was Meghan Markle. Her presence was electric and yet controversial. Some admired her, some envied her, and others silently questioned her right to be there. She wasn't just another actor at the party. She was a cultural phenomenon. And in a room full of people whose currency is credibility, her presence alone was enough to tilt the air. The smiles around her were carefully calibrated, the nods polite but calculating. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, in the pause before a conversation, the half-second glance, the discreet raising of eyebrows. This is the part most outsiders will never understand. Hollywood isn't just about talent. It's about legitimacy. It's about whether the people who have been in the trenches, the actors, the casting directors, the agents, the producers, believe you belong. And make no mistake, being liked by the public doesn't guarantee that kind of legitimacy. In fact, sometimes it works against you. Fame can be intimidating, threatening, or, worse, misleading. It can create a perception of influence that isn't matched by actual skill. That perception can become fragile, waiting for a single moment to crack. And that moment arrived in the form of Odessa A'zion. Odessa wasn't the most famous name in the room. She didn't arrive with a publicist trailing her every step, nor was she looking to dominate headlines. What made her dangerous, and what made this moment unforgettable, was her reputation for brutal honesty. In a world where compliments are currency and politeness a shield, Odessa's words cut straight through the noise. She speaks the truth because she respects the craft, not the fame. And tonight, she would speak it to the one person whose name alone could shift the room's delicate balance of power. Before the mic reached her, the conversation around the room continued in its familiar rhythm. People exchanged pleasantries, made calculated jokes, and silently measured each other's value. The energy was social, polished, and deceptively calm. But everyone knew the stakes. Every eye was cataloging, every ear absorbing. This is how Hollywood evaluates. Quietly, relentlessly, invisibly. Reputation is never built in grand gestures. It is forged in the subtle moments everyone thinks go unnoticed. And then Odessa had the mic. It happened in a heartbeat. The room froze, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Some understood immediately what was coming. Others would only realize it later. She turned toward Meghan Markle, who was, at that moment, the unspoken center of attention. Cameras weren't rolling in this room, and reporters weren't taking notes, yet everyone leaned forward, because in Hollywood, a well-timed line can ripple through careers like a shockwave. You have zero talent. 2 words, 3 words, depending on how you count the space between them. But the impact was immediate, profound, and unmistakable. The room didn't erupt in chaos. It didn't turn into a scene from a reality TV show. Hollywood rarely does that in private. Instead, it paused. Laughter flickered awkwardly in some corners, eyes widened slightly in others. Champagne glasses caught the light as hands tightened around them unconsciously. Every person present felt the weight of the statement, whether they were rooting for Meghan, against her, or simply fascinated by the drama unfolding in real time. The brilliance of that moment, and what made it so dangerous, was not the cruelty of the words. Cruelty is easy. The brilliance lay in the context, the timing, and the setting. The words were a mirror held up to a public figure in a room where public approval meant nothing and private judgment meant everything. It was honesty in its purest, unfiltered form, and that's what made it unforgettable. But let's rewind slightly. Because understanding this moment fully requires knowing the subtle mechanics of the room itself. Actors' Night is a place where power operates invisibly. Decisions about who gets cast, who gets funded, and whose career continues aren't made in interviews or on social media. They are made in quiet conversations, in whispers, in the way a glance is held or a comment is deflected. Reputation here is everything, and credibility is the most valuable currency of all. And reputation isn't binary. It isn't good or bad. It's layered, nuanced, fragile. One well-timed compliment or one poorly considered action can tip it either way. In this ecosystem, a single line, meticulously delivered, piercingly accurate, can shift a room. And that's exactly what Odessa did. Her words were a catalyst, a trigger, a recalibration of the room's delicate equilibrium. Now, consider Meghan Markle's position for a moment. Her public persona is a carefully constructed narrative. Every move, every speech, every public appearance is part of a story controlled by PR teams, media narratives, and public expectations. But the private industry world doesn't play by those rules. Here, narrative is secondary to perception. Here, talent, or at least the perception of talent, is scrutinized relentlessly. Here, being talked about by the press is irrelevant compared to being spoken about in these private circles. Odessa's statement wasn't merely insulting. It was a subtle dissection of that narrative. It exposed the tension between image and reality. It highlighted a growing industry skepticism that many had privately acknowledged, but no one had voiced publicly. And by doing so in this particular room, at this particular moment, Odessa turned a private critique into a turning point. And yet, for all the drama, the room did what it always does in these situations. It observed, calculated, and reacted with controlled subtlety. There were no immediate explosions, no dramatic confrontations, just the quiet acknowledgement that something significant had just occurred. Eyes shifted. Conversations paused. The invisible ledger of reputations had just been updated. But what made the moment more fascinating and more dangerous was that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of perception, both public and private. Meghan's career, her choices, her public narrative, all of it, had been quietly under review long before she walked into that hall. And Odessa's words were a crystallization of that ongoing assessment. In other words, the room wasn't shocked because the words were unprecedented. It was shocked because someone finally dared to say what everyone had been thinking. That's the double-edged sword of Hollywood honesty. It's rarely spectacular in delivery, but devastating in effect. A single sentence can ripple through careers, contracts, and future opportunities. The room understood that. Meghan understood that. And Odessa understood that, too. Which is why the timing, the tone, and the target all mattered more than the words themselves. And as the room processed the impact, as eyes met and judgments were silently passed, a new question emerged, one that would frame the rest of the night. And perhaps much more than just that evening. How would Meghan Markle respond? Would she deflect with charm, counter with confidence, or retreat into the polished public persona that had carried her through so many other situations? Because in Hollywood, response is everything. Timing is everything. And perception is everything. Before we can answer that, we need to understand the human dynamics at play. The subtle hierarchies, the cultural cues, and the psychology of a room full of people trained to evaluate not just performance on screen, but the very essence of credibility off-screen. Every raised eyebrow, every sideways glance, every brief pause in conversation is data. And for actors, agents, and producers, that data is actionable. It informs decisions, guides recommendations, and quietly shapes the trajectory of careers. In other words, this room isn't just a social gathering. It's a crucible where reputations are tested, where influence is exercised, and where one moment can silently rewrite the rules. And Odessa's statement? It didn't just puncture the air. It punctured assumptions, challenged narratives, and, in one stroke, set the stage for a reckoning that would ripple far beyond the ballroom. Because in Hollywood, being spoken about is inevitable. Being spoken about accurately is rare. And being spoken about in a room where the right people are listening is lethal. But what came next? The reactions, the subtle shifts in behavior, the quiet recalibration of attention, would change everything. And no one in that room, not even Meghan, could have fully anticipated the magnitude of the ripple that sentence had unleashed. Hollywood has a curious hierarchy. Fame is only one layer. Influence is another. But credibility, true, earned credibility, is its own currency, and it cannot be bought, faked, or borrowed. Odessa A'zion is a rare example of someone who holds that currency. She isn't a household name in the way A-list actors are. She doesn't dominate the tabloids or appear on magazine covers simply for being seen. Yet in rooms like Actors' Night, her words carry weight, sometimes devastating weight. So who is Odessa A'zion really? And why did her voice resonate so profoundly when she addressed Meghan Markle that night? Odessa comes from an acting lineage steeped in craft. She's been trained rigorously, auditioned relentlessly, and faced rejection in its most brutal forms. Her career path isn't littered with shortcuts or meteoric rises. She knows the grind. She knows the stakes. And perhaps most importantly, she respects the craft above all else. That respect manifests as honesty, a kind of honesty that is rare in an industry where flattery is often more valuable than truth. Odessa's reputation has been carefully cultivated over years. Among her peers, she is known for being candid but fair. She doesn't throw insults for shock value or social media virality. She doesn't aim to humiliate for clicks. Instead, she speaks plainly about talent, effort, and authenticity. And in Hollywood, authenticity is priceless. People recognize when someone has put in the work versus someone whose narrative has been shaped by media attention, family legacy, or external influence. It's this very distinction that makes her moment at Actors' Night so remarkable. This wasn't a random barbed comment thrown into the void. Odessa had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking so directly. In fact, a misstep could have backfired, alienating powerful figures and reshaping perceptions of her own reputation. But the opposite happened. Because in a room full of actors, producers, and agents, honesty is rare enough that it becomes a force multiplier. When Odessa spoke, her words carried the authority of experience, skill, and insight, and that authority amplified the impact of every syllable. Her presence at Actors' Night is itself notable. She isn't there to be photographed for the press. She isn't there to perform a persona. She's there to be seen by the right people, the industry insiders whose opinions matter behind closed doors. And that's critical to understanding the dynamics of that night. Hollywood doesn't care about online buzz when it comes to casting decisions. They care about credibility, relationships, and subtle, unspoken evaluations. In this context, Odessa wasn't just a participant. She was a judge, a barometer, a voice that measured the room with precision. So when she addressed Meghan Markle, the impact was amplified by more than just her words. It was amplified by who she is. Imagine a courtroom where the witness isn't just testifying. They are an expert whose opinion carries undeniable authority. Every person in that room understood this on some level. And in Hollywood, authority delivered as truth is infinitely more potent than authority delivered as hype. Now, consider the psychology at play. Odessa had the luxury of perspective. She didn't have to curry favor or manage public perception. She could speak freely because she knew the cost of dishonesty, the subtle danger of exaggeration, and the currency of credibility. In other words, she understood the mechanics of influence in this room better than most. That understanding, combined with her reputation for honesty, turned a single sentence into a seismic moment. But let's pause here. There's another layer to Odessa's authority: timing. Hollywood is a landscape of power dynamics, delicate egos, and historical grudges. Saying the right thing at the wrong time can ruin relationships. Saying the wrong thing at the right time can end careers. Odessa's timing was impeccable. She didn't speak out of turn. She didn't act impulsively. She delivered a line that cut to the core precisely when the room was primed for recognition, reflection, and judgment. That's why her words didn't fall flat. They detonated. And it wasn't just about delivering an insult. In Hollywood, the way a comment lands is as important as its content. Odessa's tone, her eye contact, the subtle inflection in her voice. All of it communicated confidence, authority, and certainty. There was no hesitation, no hint of insecurity, no room for misinterpretation. This was truth delivered with precision, And in a space where precision is respected, it cannot be ignored. We also need to consider her career context. Odessa has navigated the industry with a level of discipline and dedication that commands respect. She has endured auditions where every line was dissected, faced rejection letters that sting more than any public critique, and persevered without relying on celebrity status or manufactured narratives. Her credibility is earned, and that earns her a rare license in private industry settings, the license to speak bluntly, to call out perceived pretension, and to challenge narratives that don't align with reality. Contrast this with Meghan Markle's position in the room. Meghan's career trajectory is entwined with public visibility, media narratives, and a global persona that transcends Hollywood. While she has talent, her credibility within these private circles is a separate conversation. Hollywood insiders look beyond fame, scrutinizing skill, commitment, and authenticity. And in that regard, Odessa's voice carries weight precisely because she has walked the path that is respected here. She has earned the right to critique. It's also worth noting that Odessa's honesty isn't reckless. It's strategic. She understands nuance. She recognizes which moments call for subtle critique and which moments demand blunt clarity. Saying, "You have zero talent," in a vacuum would be dangerous, even reckless. Saying it at actors' night, in a room prepared to receive and evaluate truth, is calculated. It demonstrates an understanding of context, timing, and consequence. And that is why the line hits so hard. But let's not reduce this to a simple clash between two individuals. This moment is part of a broader pattern in Hollywood, the tension between public perception and private evaluation. Fame creates assumptions. Media narratives shape opinions. But behind closed doors, the evaluation is clinical, relentless, and unforgiving. Odessa's statement didn't emerge from thin air. It crystallized years of subtle judgments, whispered criticisms, and unspoken doubts. It was the verbalization of what many in the room had quietly thought, now given voice by someone with credibility. And here's the kicker. Credibility is contagious. When someone like Odessa speaks, others pay attention. When she judges, others reconsider their own perceptions. When she delivers a truth no one else dares to voice, it sets the tone for the entire room. That's the real power she wielded that night. Not malice, not cruelty, but the authority to articulate what others were thinking. By now, it should be clear why this was so much more than a simple roast. Odessa A'zion wasn't just targeting Meghan Markle. She was holding up a mirror to the room and to the industry itself, reflecting the tension between fame and craft, visibility and legitimacy, narrative and reality. Her words forced attention, demanded consideration, and quietly recalibrated perceptions. In Hollywood, moments like these are rare, and when they occur, their echoes are long and far-reaching. So the question that night, hanging in the air like a charged particle ready to strike, wasn't just, what did she say? It was, who has the authority to say it? And why does it matter? The answer is Odessa A'zion. And that's why when the sentence landed, the room didn't just react. They listened. They processed. They measured. And, without realizing it, they all adjusted their mental maps of power, talent, and influence. As the words sank in, everyone in that room understood a subtle, unspoken truth. Credibility in Hollywood isn't granted by fame, pedigree, or public attention. It is earned through skill, experience, and honesty. And that night, Odessa A'zion's voice carried more credibility than almost anyone else present. But what came next, the reactions, the recalibration of attention, and Meghan's response, would determine whether that credibility would be celebrated, ignored, or weaponized. And no one, not even Odessa herself, could predict the full impact of the ripple she had just created. Hollywood is a place where perception often outweighs reality, where fame can mask talent, and media narratives can shape opportunities as much as auditions. And few examples illustrate this more starkly than Meghan Markle. To understand why Odessa A'zion's words landed so powerfully, we first need to dissect the Hollywood perception of Meghan, a perception that has been both cultivated and contested for over a decade. Let's start at the beginning. Meghan's early acting career was relatively modest. She appeared in television shows and small film roles, working steadily but without explosive recognition. In this phase, she was one of many aspiring actors, navigating the rigorous audition process and the relentless rejection that defines Hollywood. She experienced what every actor knows intimately: waiting in lobbies, memorizing lines that may never be used, hearing "thank you, but no" again and again. This is the crucible that separates those who are solely performers from those who are taken seriously in the industry. Then came Suits, a turning point that catapulted her into visibility. The show gave her a platform, a fan base, and a professional credibility she hadn't previously enjoyed. Within Hollywood circles, her talent was now visible, her skill acknowledged. But here's where the complexity begins. Her rise coincided with public fascination beyond the entertainment industry. She was no longer just an actress. She became a cultural figure, a personality whose off-screen life commanded media attention, often eclipsing her on-screen achievements. And then came royalty. Marrying into the British royal family elevated Meghan's public profile to an entirely new level. Suddenly, she wasn't measured solely by acting ability. She was measured by charisma, diplomacy, and media optics on a global stage. Her every move, speeches, interviews, appearances, was scrutinized with the intensity reserved for figures of immense public interest. The line between celebrity and cultural symbol blurred. For the general public, Meghan's image became larger than her actual body of work. This is where Hollywood insiders diverge in opinion. In private industry circles, fame is not a substitute for craft. Casting directors, producers, and agents weigh skill, consistency, and dedication over visibility or narrative. The room at Actors Night embodies this principle. It doesn't care if millions know your name. It cares if the people whose judgments determine roles and career trajectories respect your craft. And in that private ecosystem, perception becomes complex. Meghan's fame might impress the public, but insiders are trained to look behind the media gloss, to examine depth, nuance, and resilience. There's also an irony here. The very fame that creates opportunities can also amplify scrutiny. The higher the visibility, the higher the expectations. And Hollywood is unforgiving when public narrative overshadows perceived ability. Actors who rise rapidly or gain global attention through channels outside traditional industry merit are often treated with skepticism, whether openly expressed or subtly signaled. Casting discussions, insider jokes, and private evaluations often contain subtext that rarely reaches public view. Which brings us to the critical tension at Actors Night. In that room, Meghan's public fame collided with private judgment. She is, for all intents and purposes, both an insider and an outsider. An insider because she has held professional acting roles and cultivated relationships within Hollywood. An outsider because her narrative has been shaped as much by global media coverage and public fascination as by her work. This duality makes her presence complicated, precarious, and, for some, provocative. And that's why Odessa A'zion's remark resonated. When someone with credibility states that Meghan has zero talent, it cuts to this underlying tension. The dissonance between perception and professional assessment. It exposes the gap between visibility and craft, between fame and legitimacy. In a room calibrated to measure skill above everything else, such a statement functions not as an insult alone, but as a mirror, reflecting the subtle, often unspoken consensus that may have existed in whispers before it was spoken aloud. But let's examine the stakes further. Meghan's Hollywood image is a layered construction. Publicly, she embodies charisma, elegance, and social influence. Privately, she is evaluated on technique, versatility, and professional consistency. These dual lenses rarely align, and when they clash, they create friction that insiders can sense immediately. This tension explains the pause in the room when Odessa spoke. The audience recognized the duality. Some may have thought the statement harsh. Others may have felt relief that the quiet observations they had been making were now validated. It's important to acknowledge the contradictions in perception. To the public, Meghan's fame seems unstoppable, her presence undeniable. To Hollywood insiders, her credibility is more contested, scrutinized under a microscope. And in private industry settings, fame can actually be a liability. It raises expectations that must be met consistently. It invites analysis that ordinary actors never face. And it can obscure subtle gaps between public persona and professional skill. we also have to consider the human element. Hollywood insiders are acutely aware of the difference between effort and outcome. They recognize craft honed over years, trial and error, and painstaking dedication. When someone's visibility is largely shaped by narrative, media attention, or personal brand, it can create an undercurrent of skepticism. This is not necessarily malicious. It's a survival mechanism in an industry built on judgment. And it explains why a blunt remark, delivered by someone with Odessa's credibility, can reverberate more powerfully than 100 tabloid critiques. Now, add timing into the equation. Public perception can be a double-edged sword, but timing determines its impact. In 2025, Hollywood's cultural climate is especially attuned to authenticity. Audiences, critics, and industry insiders alike are increasingly sensitive to the difference between manufactured relevance and earned credibility. A casual observer might see the roast as mere spectacle, but for insiders, it is a moment of evaluation, a calibration of who commands respect, who delivers substance, and who relies on narrative weight rather than craft. This is where we confront a deeper question. Has Meghan's Hollywood image been built or borrowed? Fame can be borrowed through media narratives, royal association, and public fascination. Influence can be borrowed through social capital and public adoration. But credibility, true industry credibility, is earned, and in private rooms like Actors' Night, it is tested relentlessly. Odessa's remark functioned as a stress test, challenging the assumptions about visibility, skill, and legitimacy. And yet, it wasn't just about Meghan. It was about the room itself. It was about Hollywood's unspoken rules. It was about the delicate balance between public admiration and private evaluation. Actors, agents, and producers are always calculating, always judging. When someone like Odessa speaks with authority, the room listens. That sentence, "You have zero talent," was both a critique and a revelation. A spotlight on the tension between image and industry perception, between narrative and craft, between earned respect and borrowed attention. By the time the words fully sank in, the room had shifted. Conversations paused. Eyes flicked from one attendee to another. Some nodded subtly, silently acknowledging the truth in a way that could never be articulated publicly. Others remained still, absorbing the implications. Every person present recalibrated their mental ledger of credibility, influence, and professional standing. In this context, the line was not just a roast. It was a statement of power, authority, and judgment. And yet, for all its impact, the moment had only just begun. Because the power of such a statement lies not only in its delivery, but in the response it provokes. The room, the audience, and the individual being addressed all play roles in the unfolding drama. And in Hollywood, the response often matters more than the initial statement. So the tension grew. The room was quiet, charged, aware. The air seemed thicker, heavier. The question lingering in the minds of everyone present, insiders and observers alike, was simple yet profound. How would Meghan Markle respond? Would she maintain poise, deflect with charm, or reveal the cracks beneath the public persona carefully curated over years? The answer would determine the trajectory not only of that evening, but potentially of perception within the industry itself. But what came next? The reactions, the recalibration of alliances, and the subtle psychological shifts would change everything in ways no one anticipated. And no one in that room, including Meghan herself, could fully predict the ripple effects that Odessa's words would unleash. The words were short. The impact was anything but. "You have zero talent." 3 words, delivered with precision, spoken in a room full of people whose judgments are quiet but decisive. On the surface, it might sound like a simple insult, something meant to provoke laughter or shock. But in the context of Actors' Night, in that particular room, and directed at that particular person, it was far more than an insult. It was a verdict, a reflection of perceptions long simmering beneath the polite smiles, polite nods, and carefully curated conversations. Let's break this down. The audience, industry insiders who have spent decades observing nuance, heard these words in a way that the general public rarely can. They heard subtext layered over intent, heard reputation colliding with reality. They heard a moment that validated suspicions, challenged assumptions, and reframed narratives. And most importantly, They heard truth delivered with authority, the kind of truth that Hollywood prizes when evaluating peers. Odessa A'zion didn't merely speak. She performed an act of observation and judgment. Every pause, every inflection, every glance was calibrated. This wasn't a misfire. This wasn't casual humor. This was deliberate. In her delivery, the words carried the weight of experience, of credibility, of someone who had earned the right to speak the truth about craft, skill, and legitimacy. But here's where things get fascinating. What was said versus what was heard. For the general public, filtered through social media snippets, gossip columns, and sound bites, the moment might be reduced to petty drama, a celebrity roast gone wrong. But in that room, what people actually heard was layered. They heard a critique not just of Meghan's acting abilities, but of the perception versus reality of her career, her trajectory, and her claimed skill. They heard a challenge to the narrative that public visibility equals credibility. They heard the crystallization of private industry skepticism voiced in a way that demanded attention. This duality, the gap between perception and interpretation, is essential to understanding the magnitude of the moment. On one hand, the statement was undeniably confrontational. On the other hand, it was accurate, measured, and meaningful within the private ecosystem of Hollywood evaluation. The room didn't laugh outright. It didn't erupt in scandal. It listened. It processed. It judged quietly, with the careful discernment that insiders bring to every interaction. Odessa's tone was critical to the impact. She didn't sneer. She didn't mock. There was no overt hostility. Instead, there was a calm precision, a delivery that implied observation rather than attack. The statement carried confidence, authority, and inevitability. It was the verbal equivalent of a slow-moving arrow, impossible to deflect and impossible to ignore. In moments like this, Hollywood insiders pay attention not just to the content of words, but to the delivery, to the subtext, and to the credibility of the speaker. Then there was Meghan. Her reaction, or the way the room interpreted it, was subtle, layered, and revealing. She did not respond with overt anger. She did not interrupt or lash out. Instead, there was a microcosm of gestures. A pause, a brief intake of breath, a fractionally tightened jaw. These small physical cues carry enormous weight in a room trained to read the unspoken. Observers in the room registered everything. Every eye movement, every tilt of the head, every shift in posture was cataloged, assessed, and interpreted. This is Hollywood's private language of evaluation, unspoken, but incredibly precise. Now, let's explore why this moment resonated so broadly within the room. Hollywood operates on subtle hierarchies and invisible rules. People don't openly call out celebrity unless the stakes are high, the timing is right, and the messenger carries authority. Odessa checked all three boxes. She had the credibility, the timing, and the skill to make the statement land in a way that demanded attention. No one in the room could dismiss it without also acknowledging the underlying truth it implied. And yet, the statement also had layers of humor. In public perception, humor often acts as a shield for controversy. But in this context, humor was secondary. It was the delivery mechanism, the sugar that allowed a bitter truth to travel without immediate backlash. The room understood this nuance. Humor softened the blow externally, but emphasized the judgment internally. The audience laughed, but the laughter was edged with tension, recognition, and validation. It was nervous laughter for some, knowing laughter for others, and acknowledgement for those in the know. Consider the timing. The moment came when the room was relaxed, conversations flowing, and attention subtly shifting from one corner of the ballroom to another. Timing matters in comedy, yes, but timing matters even more in judgment. Odessa's delivery exploited the perfect moment when all eyes and ears were primed, ensuring maximum resonance. In essence, the statement became not just a critique of talent, but a performance of perception, a public articulation of private observation, and a subtle recalibration of the room's social hierarchy. There is also a psychological component. Being called out in front of peers, especially peers whose opinions influence opportunities, is an intense experience. For the person targeted, there's an immediate evaluation. How do I respond? Do I deflect? Do I demonstrate composure? Do I counter? The room watches, silent and attentive. In Hollywood, Response is often more important than action. The way an actor reacts can cement or erode credibility faster than any statement could. And so the tension in the room escalated. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene for the cameras. It was the quiet, potent kind of tension that only true industry insiders understand. The room collectively held its breath, processing both the content and the implications. Some nodded subtly in acknowledgement. Some smiled faintly, recognizing the underlying truth. And some stared, calculating how this moment might influence their own networks, alliances, and future decisions. Finally, there's the ripple effect to consider. A single statement in a room like this doesn't exist in isolation. It travels. It informs conversations in hallways, during cocktail exchanges, in late-night phone calls, and eventually in casting decisions. That three-word sentence becomes a lens through which industry insiders assess talent, ambition, and credibility. Odessa's words didn't just punctuate a roast. They initiated a cascade of perception shifts that would extend far beyond the ballroom walls. And yet, even with all this context, there was an unanswered question hanging in the air. How would Meghan handle this challenge to her credibility? Would she pivot with charm, reinforcing her narrative? Would she counter with assertiveness, demonstrating authority? Or would the statement undermine the carefully cultivated image she had spent years building? The answer was critical because in Hollywood, a single response, or a single misstep, can alter the trajectory of influence and opportunity permanently. But what came next? The reactions, the subtle recalibration of the room, and Meghan's own response would escalate the moment from a private judgment to a defining moment. No one could have predicted the full scope of its impact, and no one, not even Odessa, could have anticipated the intensity of the ripple effect she had just set in motion. In Hollywood, the loudest voices don't always matter. The quiet observations, the subtle nods, the micro-reactions, the ones almost impossible for outsiders to see, carry far more weight. And in that room, after Odessa's words landed, the atmosphere shifted instantly, like the tension before a storm. The chandeliers flickered, the low hum of conversation faltered, and eyes darted toward the epicenter of the moment, Meghan Markle. Some people laughed. Not the kind of uproarious, camera-ready laughter you see in award shows or sitcoms. This was nervous, almost reflexive. The kind of laughter that humans use to acknowledge discomfort, tension, or truth that is too sharp to ignore. It wasn't joy. It wasn't mockery. It was recognition. Recognition that someone had spoken what others had quietly thought, whispered, or analyzed for months, or even years. Others froze. A sharp intake of breath, a pause mid-sentence, a glass held slightly tighter in hand. In Hollywood, freeze moments like this are fascinating. They indicate processing. They reveal who is reevaluating, recalculating, and quietly assessing the credibility of the speaker. Every glance, every slight shift in posture, every small facial expression becomes data. For actors, producers, and agents in the room, this is the currency of judgment. And then there were those who looked away, not out of disrespect, but out of survival instinct. Watching such a confrontation unfold is dangerous. To align too clearly with one side could invite scrutiny. To react too strongly could indicate bias, insecurity, or vulnerability. In Hollywood's private circles, the art of observation often outweighs the need for immediate engagement. Silence is strategic. In that room, silence meant calculation, not indifference. What made this reaction extraordinary was the layering of emotions, subtext, and calculation. The room wasn't simply reacting to an insult. It was reacting to authority, credibility, and timing, all delivered in one precise moment. Odessa's statement cut through not just narrative, but expectation. The audience wasn't watching a joke land. They were witnessing the private articulation of a truth long understood, long evaluated, but never verbalized. Some observers nodded subtly, almost imperceptibly. These were the insiders who recognized the accuracy of the assessment, or at least the validity of its delivery. They had been part of conversations behind closed doors, whispering judgments, quietly noting patterns, and making mental calculations. Odessa's words gave them a form of validation. It confirmed suspicions and crystallized perceptions in a single, decisive statement. Meanwhile, others assessed Meghan's reaction. In Hollywood, watching how someone handles critique or direct challenge is essential. A measured response can solidify authority, composure, and credibility. A defensive reaction can erode influence. And in a room calibrated to detect every micro-expression, every subtle change in posture, every shift in eye contact, these reactions speak louder than the original words themselves. The dynamics were fascinating. On one side, there was the bold statement, delivered with precision, authority, and credibility. On the other side, there was the target, caught in the intersection of public image, private scrutiny, and immediate evaluation. And surrounding both, the silent observers, each processing, measuring, and internalizing. Hollywood thrives on moments like this, not for entertainment, not for headlines, but as a mechanism of evaluation and survival. It's worth pausing to examine why subtle reactions matter more than dramatic ones. Hollywood is not a space for spontaneous outbursts in private settings. It is a space where every word, every gesture, and every reaction is recorded in memory, analyzed, and referenced in future decisions. A subtle nod, a slight shift in posture, a carefully measured laugh. All of these carry information. They inform reputations, influence casting choices, and calibrate the network of alliances and influence. Odessa's words had created a disruption, but the room's reaction would determine whether that disruption became a ripple or a wave. Even more, the reaction reveals something about human psychology in high-stakes environments. People are simultaneously drawn to conflict and repelled by it. They seek truth but fear accountability. They crave honesty but are wary of exposure. In that room, these forces collided. Every reaction, whether laughter, freeze, or avoidance, was a manifestation of the tension between acknowledgement and self-preservation. And let's not overlook the power of relief. Some in the room had likely been privately critical of Meghan's credibility for years, but they had never voiced it publicly. Odessa's statement offered validation, a release of tension. For these individuals, the moment was not hostile, it was liberating. Finally, someone had spoken the quiet truth, confirming suspicions and providing clarity. That mix of relief, tension, and calculation created an atmosphere almost palpable in its intensity. But the story doesn't end there. Every reaction has implications. Laughter may signal agreement, but it also creates alliances. Pauses may indicate contemplation, but they also suggest doubt. Avoidance may protect oneself, but it also betrays attention. In Hollywood, these signals are remembered, referenced, and leveraged long after the event ends. Odessa's words, and the room's reaction, became part of an ongoing ledger of credibility, influence, and professional evaluation. And then there's the most subtle reaction of all. The silence of those who chose neither to react outwardly nor to disengage completely. In private circles, silence can carry enormous meaning. It indicates observation, assessment, and judgment without exposure. It signals a cautious alignment with reality rather than performance. These silent observers, arguably the most influential in the room, were registering the event, cataloging impressions, and integrating the moment into the broader context of Hollywood dynamics. Finally, we circle back to the target. Meghan's response, or lack thereof, was being scrutinized in real time. Every gesture, every blink, every micro-expression carried meaning. In a room where perception often trumps reality, her reaction would be evaluated more intensely than the original statement itself. Could she maintain composure? Could she assert credibility without seeming defensive? Could she navigate the tension between public persona and private scrutiny? The answers were not immediately clear, and the suspense added a layer of tension to the entire room. But here's the critical insight. The room's reaction, layered, nuanced, and multifaceted, is what transformed a simple statement into a defining moment. It was the collective processing, the interplay of observation, judgment, and subtle signaling that elevated the moment from a private comment to a turning point. The silent, measured, and sometimes contradictory responses were the real story. A story that demonstrates the depth of Hollywood's private ecosystem, where careers, reputations, and influence are constantly under evaluation. And as the room absorbed the statement, adjusted its energy, and recalibrated attention, the question lingered: how would Meghan respond to the authority of this critique? Her next move could validate her public persona, undermine her credibility, or redefine the narrative entirely. The room was poised, holding its collective breath, waiting for the answer. But what came next? The reaction, the subtle recalibration of power, and the quiet but decisive moments that followed, would change everything in ways that no one, not even the speaker, could have anticipated. The room was charged. You could feel it, even without the hyperbole of a dramatic camera angle or a media narrative. Tension in Hollywood doesn't always announce itself with shouting or applause. It manifests subtly. A sharp intake of breath, a barely perceptible shift in posture, a flicker of the eyes. In that room at Actors' Night, after Odessa A'zion's words landed, the energy was taut. Everyone was waiting, silently, for Meghan Markle to respond. Hollywood has a peculiar fascination with poise. It isn't just about looking graceful or composed. It's about demonstrating control under pressure. Poise signals authority, confidence, and legitimacy. In private circles like this, the ability to maintain poise in the face of critique can strengthen credibility far more than any past accomplishment or headline. Conversely, visible defensiveness, flustered reactions, or forced laughter can erode influence in ways subtle but permanent. At that moment, Meghan faced a high-stakes test. Her public image, a carefully curated blend of charisma, elegance, and global relevance, was suddenly juxtaposed against a blunt critique delivered by someone with genuine industry credibility. For the first time in that room, visibility could not shield her. Narrative could not insulate her. What mattered was presence, poise, and the unspoken evaluation of skill and legitimacy. She paused, not dramatically, but strategically. The micro-pause, almost imperceptible to casual observers, was a signal of cognitive processing, of weighing options, of deciding how to navigate the delicate balance between acknowledgement and deflection. Every person in that room trained themselves to read these micro-behaviors. Actors, casting directors, agents, and producers alike. That pause, small as it was, became a focal point, drawing attention without needing to say a word. Then came her response. Meghan chose her words carefully, delivering a measured reaction rather than an emotional outburst. She acknowledged the statement, not with confrontation, but with subtle recognition. There was no aggressive defense, no public outrage, no attempt to redirect attention to status or past accomplishments. Instead, she exuded controlled composure, signaling that she understood the critique, was capable of processing it, and was confident enough in herself not to overreact. In Hollywood, that kind of measured response is powerful. It communicates authority, maturity, and self-awareness. It transforms a potentially destabilizing critique into a stage for demonstrating professionalism. It also forces observers to recalibrate. They must now consider not just the original statement, but the response, which can either validate or undermine the speaker's authority. But even with poise, the tension did not dissipate. The room remained alert. Eyes still flicked between Meghan and Odessa. Conversations paused mid-flow. Hands unconsciously tightened around glasses. People were assessing, analyzing, and mentally adjusting their perceptions. The dynamics of power and credibility were in flux, reshaped by this singular interaction. This tension illustrates a fundamental truth about Hollywood's private ecosystem. Influence is not static. It is constantly negotiated through words, gestures, and unspoken evaluations. A moment of critique, followed by a measured response, can ripple through the room, affecting future casting considerations, collaborative opportunities, and even the subtler networks of mentorship and alliance that define the industry. Odessa's role in this dynamic cannot be overstated. Her credibility gave weight to the critique, but Meghan's response determined how that weight would be absorbed, resisted, or redirected. The interplay between statement and reaction created a kind of microdrama, observed silently but intensely by everyone present. The room became a theater of perception, judgment, and strategy, where subtle cues mattered far more than volume or spectacle. Consider the psychological dimension. For anyone in the room, witnessing this interaction was a lesson in power dynamics. Authority does not always reside in status. It often resides in credibility and timing. Poise does not always require domination. It requires self-awareness and control. Influence is shaped as much by response to critique as by the initial actions that generate attention. Odessa's blunt statement met Meghan's controlled composure in a collision of industry dynamics that left the audience quietly recalibrating their perceptions. And yet, even with a poised response, the situation remained volatile. The subtext of Odessa's critique, the underlying skepticism within the room, and the awareness of media narratives all lingered, creating layers of tension that would not dissipate immediately. The room remained charged, and every subsequent interaction was now colored by this exchange. Whispered conversations, subtle glances, and recalculated evaluations began to ripple through the crowd, quietly reshaping the social landscape of the evening. There was also an element of suspense. Hollywood insiders instinctively understood that the next moments were critical. Meghan's subsequent interactions, whether with peers, producers, or casting directors, would be scrutinized as extensions of this defining instant. Every smile, every handshake, every word would be filtered through the lens of that moment. Poise in response to critique is not just defensive, it is strategic, and it can influence perceptions long after the event concludes. But there's another layer to consider: the human drama beneath the industry dynamics. This wasn't just about careers, credibility, or public perception. It was about vulnerability. It was about the delicate balance between self-assuredness and exposure. In that moment, Meghan was navigating a crucible of evaluation, visibility, and judgment, all under the scrutiny of people trained to notice imperceptible shifts in behavior.